Yo ho ho, welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So I am doing my mid-year reading wrap-up because I have not done one goddamn book review at all this year on this channel. Initially, I was just like, oh, I'll just do quarterly reading wrap-ups, and then I never did that at the end of March. And now we're here and I feel really bad about it. So let's get into all the books that I read from January to June. I think after this, I'm absolutely going to be going back to monthly reading wrap-ups because I feel so stressed out. I've been putting off this video for so long and it's only been getting worse for myself. So yeah, instead of reviewing 7 books, I'm now having to review 30 something books all in one go. So hopefully this goes well. Let's get into it. So the first book of the year that I read was The Hotel by Daisy Johnson. So this is a short story collection, and from the title, it is about a mysterious Gothic hotel that attracts a lot of people to it, whether it's people who've visited there, who've lived there, who've worked there. This hotel just has a hold on people and just does not let them leave. So each short story in this is from the perspective of an anonymous narrator, and sometimes you will notice that the same narrator pops up in different stories just based on what they're saying and how they'll reference something that we've already read. So there is a kind of linear element to these short stories. There is an element that kind of keeps them all connected to one another. Because of the anonymity of the characters, you definitely feel as a reader that you are being kind of kept at a distance, and it's kind of for your own safety so that you don't get sucked into this hotel obsession, this feeling that you just can't leave it behind. But I think this short story collection is perfect for fans of The Shining by Stephen King, for fans of the TV show American Horror Story Hotel. Also, if you're someone who likes listening to audiobooks, I'd recommend checking this out via its audiobook because apparently it got a lot of radio play and a lot of traction because the audiobook of this is so well done, and it seems like it's much more enjoyable than actually reading it. It just brings the story together in a completely different way and it makes it much more immersive. So check that out if you're interested. The next book that I read was Graveyard Shift by ML Rio. So this was probably my first major disappointment of 2025. I didn't have super high hopes for it because I wasn't a huge fan of ML Rio's previous work, but I was still looking forward to it because I like the dark academia subgenre. I like murder mysteries and things like that. So the story follows 5 characters who regularly cross each other's paths in this old, unused cemetery as they work their respective graveyard shifts. And one night during a smoke break, they discover that a new grave has been dug and there's something very mysterious lurking in this grave. It becomes a kind of whodunit, murder-ish mystery tale, but unfortunately the length of this novella really did hinder the storytelling ability of it. I feel like it felt very rushed in areas, and especially towards the end. We didn't really have enough space to really get to know each of these characters. They were very one-dimensional, and as a result, I didn't feel necessarily invested in each of the stories or what was ultimately going to happen to them. It's very heavy on the academic/medical jargon, and I found that quite off-putting at first, but it took me a little while to kind of get into the rhythm of it, and I would say that the prose is probably the best thing about this novella. In the end, the novella left a lot to be desired, and the ending was incredibly rushed, and it had this kind of wink wink nudge nudge type of ending that a lot of people found really disappointing, myself included. So the first physical book that I actually get to show you in this is Coup de Grace by Sofia Ajram. So this is another novella. I was really looking forward to it. I'd seen this pop up in a couple of people's best books of 2024, so I was really looking forward to it. So this follows our main character Vicken, who has decided that he is going to end his own life. The means of which he's going to do it through is by drowning himself in a river. But to get to this river, he has to take public transport, so he takes the subway. And when he gets off at what he perceives is his stop, is that he realizes this subway that he's in doesn't seem to go anywhere. It seems to loop. It seems to be an endless labyrinth, and there may be something else down there with him. So the idea right off the bat that he is stuck in some sort of purgatory place was really, really interesting for me. I think the prose in this story was incredibly strong. There was a lot of discussion centering around mental health and mental illness that really made me think about things in a different way. It gave me a new sort of perspective, and I have my own mental health issues and things like that, but I think this was able to kind of get under my skin because of those reasons, but also just give me a lot of food for thought. And I think that it dealt with those themes in a very raw but realistic manner. When it gets down to it, this novella really just explores the alienation that mental illness can inflict on those who suffer from it, and it did so in such a moving way. At times it was very heavy, it was uncomfortable, but it was very necessary to inflict those feelings upon the reader in order for them to kind of understand the perspective of where our main character was coming from. And even though we don't know that much about our main character Vicken, you just can't help but root for him in order to get out of this endless subway and hope that he's able to turn his life around. So if you're someone who really enjoys the gothic horror trope and you want to read more modern versions of it, this is definitely one to pick up. Then I finally picked up Where I End by Sophie White. This is a book that I was really looking forward to. In this story, we follow our main character Aileen as she is living in rural Ireland. She's living on an island off the coast of Ireland, actually, and she has a very isolated life. She never really went to school. She doesn't have any friends. And she's very much forced to stay at home to look after her incapacitated mother. She lives in the family home with herself, her mother, and her grandmother, and her grandmother take turns at looking after her mother. Aileen has a very different perspective on her mother. She has a lot of resentment towards her mother because she is stuck living this life as a carer. And she even refers to her mother as the bed thing. So she has a lot of dehumanization issues when it comes to her mother. Believing that her family is cursed, it's not until a new woman arrives on the island and kind of completely shakes up Aileen's perspective on herself and her potential future. Finally finding a friend in this woman, she's able to be herself, but she also is aware that she has to kind of rewrite some of her own history, that she can't let her know that her mother is alive and that she's just stepping out, abandoning her responsibilities at home. And during this period, we really see Aileen's diminished mental capacity in the sense of the fact that she has been so isolated all these years. She doesn't really take social cues, and she also seems to have a good bit of arrested development. And this causes her to not understand certain things with her new friend and to act out and lash out. And as a result, we end up getting one of the most unhinged female characters that I've ever encountered in a book. I will say that I absolutely ate this book up. I loved the fact that it was written by an Irish author, that it centers around Irish characters, and that there's just so many despicable things that happen within it. It's a book that really kept me guessing while I was reading it. I could have never, in my wildest dreams, predicted the ending. To me, it was very reminiscent of The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks, so if you liked that type of story, you're definitely going to enjoy this one. Then I read I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Iain Reid, and I will say out of the 3 novels that I've read by Iain Reid so far, this was the most disappointing to me. I did see the film adaptation before reading it, and I wasn't a huge fan of it. It didn't really make a lot of sense to me, so I was hoping that I would gain some more insight to reading the novel, but when I finished it I was like, okay, I might have gotten a tad little bit more insight, but I still kind of feel the same way. This follows our main character as she's on a trip to meet up with her boyfriend's parents and to stay at their family home. And while she's been driven up to the parents' house, she's having this internal anguish over the fact that she knows she wants to break up with her boyfriend, and now that she's had that thought, she really just can't silence it. It's all she's thinking about. And things just kind of go from bad to worse for her. I will say that I think the weakest part of this book was the writing style. At times it was quite fever dream-esque, and I really, really don't gel well with that type of writing. I don't like it when the writing makes me feel disorientated. I don't like when the writing makes me reread paragraph after paragraph and it still doesn't make sense to me in my head. I'm pretty good at visualizing what I'm reading, but at times this book made it impossible to do so. So I still feel like there were fragments of this book that I just wasn't able to properly understand, which is such a shame because I really thoroughly enjoyed Foe and We Spread, also by Iain Reid. I just felt disappointed with my overall reading experience with it. The next book that I read was a random one that I picked up, and it turned out to be such a blessing in disguise because I absolutely adored it. It was kind of predictable when it came to the ending, but I wouldn't use that to fault it, and I just was able to kind of like bring myself out of a semi-reading slump with it. And that book was William by Mason Coile. So this is kind of a haunted house story, but with AI. And it's my first time reading this sort of take. And I think that's why it impressed me so much, because I have nothing really to compare it to reading wise. So it follows our main character, Henry, who is an incredible robotics engineer, but he also suffers from agoraphobia. So he's just living in his house with his very heavily pregnant wife, and he is just completely invested in his work. She suggests to him that he take a break from all his work to focus on, friendship again. So she invites a couple of people over for lunch so that her husband can take a break and just be a social creature again for the first time in a really long time. William, the robot that's being worked on, is so unhinged, so jealous, and so full of himself. He just can't let this happen. And during this lunch, he really just displays his full capability of what he's been built to do. The house isn't really a normal house. With Henry being such a pro engineer, he's designed the house to be a smart house. So we have a whole kind of 2001 Space Odyssey sort of vibe to it. The one thing that I do think is the downside of this book is that the ending is incredibly predictable. Even though I think it worked well for the story, it would have been nice had I not been bang on the nose about it. But aside from that, it was a really enjoyable read. I pretty much read it in one sitting. Again, it was completely unexpected. I just randomly picked it up out of the library because I knew it was a new horror release of 2024, and I was kind of on a mission at the time to kind of read more recently released horror novels to see if they were any good. And yeah, there was a lot of flops, which will be my next one that I talk about. Another really anticipated recent horror release at the time, which was Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. So I have read 2 or 3 other Paul Tremblay novels at the time that I picked this up. I was genuinely looking forward to it, but I had seen some negative reviews at the time. So that did make me more aware that I was going into something that I may not actually like. And unfortunately, I ended up giving this book 2 stars because it wasn't what I expected it to be, but I also just absolutely hated the formatting of this book. So the story follows a now middle-aged main character who is working in movies, and he's trying to get his screenplay that he's been working on for a while that's based on a true story to be produced. And it kind of jumps back and forth in the timeline from his current experience with meeting with producers and investors and all that sort of thing, and jumping back in time to what inspired his screenplay, which was his own experience working on a horror movie in the 80s. This horror movie ended up never being released because it was regarded as a cursed endeavor to begin with. There was a lot of issues with the cast and the filming, and initially you could look at it and be like, oh yeah, they just had some hiccups, but then things just turn really, really dark. So I understood what this novel was trying to do, and I understood the feelings that it was trying to convey to me, the kind of story and how it jumped back and forth in time pretty much non-stop. I just find that I get a little bit of whiplash when doing that. But overall, I don't think this book was very well written. I think the plot was pretty boring. It didn't really go anywhere that I was necessarily interested in. I didn't like the main character. I didn't really like any of the other supporting characters. I didn't feel invested. I don't know. I just feel like the whole story felt underdeveloped. It felt like maybe something that should have been given an extra 6 months to have really been worked out. The writing style itself really didn't appeal to me, and I just felt so incredibly disappointed. Getting into the 3 books that I read in February now, I started off with what I was hoping to be a fairly strong read by getting my first nonfiction of the year out of the way. And unfortunately, it wasn't for me. That book was Feeding the Monster by Anna Bogutskaya. So this was a book that I was really looking forward to. I was in such a mood to read some nonfiction, especially about the horror genre, because usually when it comes to nonfiction, I like reading, autobiographies and memoirs and that sort of thing. I never really read nonfiction about certain topics. So I made the effort to find a book that sounded like it was going to be right up my alley. And unfortunately, I was really mistaken with it, as this book focuses more so on horror movies than it does on horror novels. It definitely does mention a couple of horror novels in it, but I thought there would be more of like a 50-50 balance to it, or really that there would be more discourse on the influence of the horror genre from the literature side of things. I wasn't a huge fan of how this book was formatted. It was told through multiple chapters, but I felt so mentally fatigued by the time I was finished with it. And at a certain point, I really thought I was going to DNF it. And I really don't like DNFing books. Like I only DNF when it is an absolute necessary thing to do. Because this book is mostly just horror film recommendations. So even though it gives itself the umbrella of the chapter titles and you know going into it that it's going to be relating to something that is referenced in the chapter title, it really does go above and beyond to just throw every single movie in that subgenre at you. I really do feel that at times this book should have taken a step back and given itself room to ruminate on the topics that it was talking about. But instead, the author was just continuously referencing horror film after horror film after horror film. At a certain point, she references 3 different horror films in just one sentence. It was way too overwhelming for me. And it just made the reading of it very clunky. It really weighed down the writing. I really would have appreciated if we had taken a good amount of those horror film recommendations and maybe put them in the back of the book and just maybe had then like 5 or 6 horror films to talk about in each chapter and really just explore what those horror films did for the topic at hand. But it was just too much for me. I just, like I said, I felt completely and utterly overwhelmed by it. I didn't think the writing style was all that great. I think that the author maybe should have taken some more time to just kind of plot out and organize how she was going to go about writing this type of book. Again, it just didn't feel like it was well executed. It didn't feel like it was well edited. I would say that this is the type of book for someone who absolutely loves horror films and just wants more horror film recommendations. But aside from that, I can't really vouch for this book all that much. The best book that I read in February, though, was Jackal by Erin E. Adams. This was an incredible novel. It's probably like my second or third favourite novel of the year that I've read so far. It really gave me a lot of vibes of Yellow Jacket, so if you love that show, you definitely need to check out this book. So this follows our main character as she comes back to her hometown after being away for many, many years, and she doesn't really get on with a lot of people from her hometown. She's got no real reason to be back aside from the fact that her best friend is getting married. She comes back and she realizes that the place is exactly how she remembers it to be. The reason why she has so many issues with this town is that when she was growing up, she was one of the only Black people in this town. And it's still very much the same now. But there's this other underlying plot line of young Black girls who have gone missing historically in this town. And what's really upsetting about it is that the police have never really looked into it. They've never really done anything about it. There was only 1 or 2 girls that got kind of more attention, but the rest of them have really been forgotten about to the point where some of them were never even reported missing to begin with. So that's very much at the forefront of our main character's mind. And while she's at the wedding, she is tasked with looking after her best friend's daughter, who's mixed race. And during the wedding, at a certain point, the daughter goes missing. So our main character realizes like, oh my God, history is repeating itself. Something has taken her. And there is some sort of horrible underlying thing that is happening within this town, specifically with young Black girls. I would say that this book is definitely more of a thriller that has horror elements to it. But honestly, when I started it, I wasn't really knowing what I was in for. And it is a book that I just could not put down. It was so engaging. I was so enthralled with it that I just couldn't stop thinking about it when I wasn't reading it, and I couldn't wait to pick it up again. And I feel like I haven't read a book like that in a really long time. And as a result, I couldn't recommend this book more. So if you're looking for a thriller that is super engaging and fast-paced, you definitely need to pick up this book. Then I read She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clarke. So this is my first time reading anything from this author, and it's a short story collection. So I was thinking like this is gonna make or break whether I end up enjoying this author's work, and it made it. This was an incredibly dark, unhinged collection of short stories. They were so memorable. The characters in each short story really just jumped off the page. They felt believable even though some of them were absolutely exaggerated. but they were so entertaining. And I think that's what I really look for, especially at the moment with short story collections. Even though I may be disappointed that a story is now over, I'm looking forward to immediately getting into the next story and what that holds. As you can tell from the title, the main theme that runs through all these stories is hunger. Whether it is someone's genuine hunger or what they hunger for in life, and the dark places of where that hunger will bring them. So if you like your short story collections, and this is pretty short, and if you like your unhinged female characters, this is absolutely the book for you. Then getting into March, I started it off by reading The Rust Maidens by Gwendolyn Kiste. So this is a copy that I picked up in my local used bookstore, which I was really excited about because for some reason this is quite expensive new. And I was just like, not about that. So it was really lucky that I just like had it in my mind and then it just suddenly like manifested itself in the bookshop for me to use with my voucher. This is also another book that jumps around in its timeline from present day to the 1980s, which I didn't really mind in this because it made sense. And it wasn't like overbearing or jarring or generally irritating. So we have two main characters in this who are best friends. And in the 1980s timeline, we basically have them finishing up secondary school and planning to go off to college. But something strange in their town starts to happen with 5 local girls as they begin to go through this really weird transformation. Their fingernails turn to glass, their bones turn to metal, and they just start corroding before everyone's eyes. And no one knows why this phenomenon is happening. And we get like experts in who are trying to analyze, is it something that these 5 girls have done? Is it something they've ingested? Is it some sort of pollution or something? And no one can figure it out. So it's down to our main character who in present day finally goes back to her hometown to lay to rest everything that she experienced as a young girl. While I was very hyped to read this, I did realize that once I started reading it, it wasn't the story that I expected it to be. And it wasn't really going in the direction that I had hoped for. And while it was still interesting and while I understood the metaphors and the themes that were explored, it didn't really stand out to me overall. So I found this to be a very down the middle type of book where I didn't hate it, but I also didn't love it. The next book that I picked up was Barrowbeck by Andrew Michael Hurley. And this was another book that I was really looking forward to. When I actually started reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is actually a short story collection. And this has been completely marketed incorrectly. This follows the village of Barrowbeck and it starts out hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and each short story is a different time period, and it ends up going into the future. By the end, there were probably only 3 short stories in this relating to the town that I genuinely found interesting, that I genuinely thought were like spine tingling and chilling to read. All the other ones I just felt like were kind of filler, were like a little bit of fluff. And while the folk horror and the folk elements in it were really good, I think because I wasn't mentally prepared to go into a short story collection, it really kind of fell short for me. And it didn't really live up to the previous books that I've read from this author. So overall, it wasn't a great experience and I ended up giving it 2 stars. Then I picked up Private Rites by Julia Armfield. This is a new author that I absolutely adore. I've now read all of her current published works. Private Rites is about 3 sisters and it's kind of a loose retelling of Shakespeare's King Lear. So we follow these 3 sisters as they are dealing with the aftermath of their father's death. Now, all 3 sisters are fairly estranged from each other. The eldest 2 are definitely the closer, and the youngest is the least closest to them as she is only related by their father and not their mother. So she's always been a little bit of an outcast, and it's not to say that her older sisters are all that interested in her, to the point where they can't really remember her age, they can't really remember these fairly important facts that you think you should know about your sister. It really was amplified to me while I was reading that, like the elder sisters, while they don't really even care that much about each other, they're all kind of narcissistic, but they really just do not have any interest in their younger sister whatsoever, and that's why they can go years without ever checking in. So when their father passes away, they're all uncomfortably brought together again, and they're trying to deal with the fallout of his death and, you know, who gets what. There are these really unfortunate secrets that end up coming to light, and their relationship gets even more strained than it was before. But it's really interesting. It's definitely a book that is a, you know, literary fiction character study of a severely dysfunctional family. And I think it would definitely be probably more impactful if you yourself have sisters. I really like having introspective reads from time to time, books that let me sit with them, and then I sit with them for weeks afterwards, you know, just going back and thinking about things and reevaluating things in my mind and all that sort of thing. And this was definitely one of those books for me. Then getting into the books that I featured in my 24-hour reading vlog, starting off with The Reyes Incident by Briana Morgan. This is the first time I've ever read anything by this author, and it definitely won't be the last. And although this novella kind of fell short for me, there was definitely moments in this that really stood out to me and that I really enjoyed horror-wise. So this follows a group of kids as they're going to this old bunker, this old decrepit bunker in the woods. And when they get down into it, into its core, they discover that there are 3 mermaid-like creatures swimming around, and they learn what the bunker was for. And I really enjoyed this kind of adaptation of the mermaids and the lore that the author chose to highlight within this. I really enjoy the subgenre of mermaids and kind of sea life and stuff in horror. And I think this was a really interesting twist on them. I think really kind of like leaning into the kind of siren aspect of it and like the manipulation and the hypnotism and all that sort of thing is super fascinating. So I would say that was the main thing about the story that I really enjoyed. It kind of follows one remaining character from this bunker as she goes to the police for help for what she experienced. It kind of turns into like a cop confession sort of thriller story. So I wasn't too fond of that aspect of it, but the mermaids were class. Then the next book that I picked up was Bat Eater by Kylie Lee Baker. This was probably my most unexpected favorite of the year so far. I got this in the Illumicrate Evernight box, and I had known that this was the book that was coming that month. I still was like, oh, I don't know if I want to read something that's based around the COVID pandemic, and you know, I was having all these kind of like minor little doubts, but obviously when it showed up at my front door in this beautiful edition, I was like, I need to read that as soon as possible. So that's what I did. And I'm so happy that I did, because this was my favorite read of the first quarter of the year. I think it was like the best book that I read. It was the best reading experience that I had when I was reading it for my 24-hour readathon. So in love with the characters. They were so entertaining. And while the story at its core is heartbreaking and it deals with racism and prejudice. So this follows Cora, our main character, and she works as a professional crime scene cleaner. So already she's interesting as hell. But we also learn that she's recently lost her sister as a result of being murdered in an Asian hate crime. She is trying to deal with that. She's trying to process that. And then she basically starts being haunted. So the story follows her and the fellow crime scene cleaners as they investigate her sister's death, as they try to track down who it was that did this, and then they realize that there may actually be a serial killer on the loose who's specifically targeting Asian people. It also brings in a lot of Asian folklore, which I was not familiar with at all, and I found it really interesting to read. And while I absolutely adored the characters, I was immediately emotionally invested in the story, and I couldn't wait to see how the 2 main storylines were going to come together in the end. There were moments in this that just absolutely destroyed me and just made me an emotional wreck. This is a book that after I read it, you know, again, it was just repeating in my mind for the next couple of weeks after I finished it. I still think it is one of the best books that I've read in 2025. So if you're looking for something to read that is much more thought-provoking than the average horror novel, that has a considerable amount of real-world trauma to it, then this is absolutely a worthwhile read, and I would honestly recommend this to anyone. It is a fantastically well-written novel. Then I finally read Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. So this is a book that I have been meaning to read again for so long now, and I finally got it off The List. I read this in pretty much one sitting. It was very readable. I was very surprised by that. So this is set in 1937 and we're following a poor British man as he is trying to make head or tail of his life, and he realizes he's at like a breaking point now. He finally lands a job going on a voyage to the Arctic, and on this expedition they have a crew of 5 men and 8 huskies, and once they get to their destination, the darkness really starts to creep in, and there is a very bloody history to the land that they find themselves on. And while they initially start dismissing the weird, unexplainable events that happen, when people start to go missing, that's when things start to get serious. This was a pretty solid horror novel. This was a pretty solid voyage, expedition, adventure horror novel. However, I absolutely love The Terror by Dan Simmons, and that will always be at the very top of my list when it comes to these types of horror novels. While it didn't knock The Terror out of its #1 spot, I still thought this was a tremendously enjoyable, haunting, ghostly book, especially if you're into the kind of 1930s, 1940s expedition type stories that are very much set in these isolated, alienated areas and there's no contact to the rest of the world. I love a good horror novel that's just shut off from everything because it just feels much more intense for me. I was really impressed by Michelle Paver's writing style. I'm really looking forward to picking up the rest of her books. Then the next book that I picked up was The Grip of It by Jac Jemc. This was the book that gave me absolutely everything that We Used to Live Here didn't. This follows a husband and a wife after they have decided to buy a new house. They're kind of downsizing and they're picking this old house that they're getting an incredible deal on. And the reason why they're downsizing is because the husband has a really severe gambling addiction and he has just caused them to go into financial ruin. So they're basically picking up everything and starting their life over. They learn that they only have one elderly neighbour in the estate that they're living in, and he is basically a shut-in hoarder who is very antisocial, who also may have ties to the house that they've purchased. And not long after they move in, the wife ends up waking up with weird bruises and scratches as if she's been accosted in the middle of the night. And there are just too many weird things that start piling on to the point where they end up staying with someone else because they're so creeped out by what's happening in the house. And there are so many different elements that the author just drops in casually that like, oh, it might be this, oh, but it might be that. Again, I read this in a really short time period, so I think that definitely did help with my overall reading experience. This book absolutely benefited from how I read it. But it also was just such an unexpected hidden gem of a horror novel. When I stumbled across it again in the used bookstore, I was like, you're coming home with me, buddy, and I'm going to read you as soon as possible. And yeah, I was just really kind of blown away by it. It wasn't a perfect novel, but it really reminded me in places of some of my other favourite horror novels. Like it reminded me a little bit of House of Leaves. It reminded me a little bit of the various Gothic books that I've read over the years. It just had a really interesting mix of elements in it, and it definitely made the work a lot stronger. You know, it was not your usual haunted house, typical tropey novel. It really did make you use your brain and really try to rack your brain in order to figure out what it was that was going on in this house and all that sort of thing. So it was a really fun read. Then I read At Dark I Become Loathsome by Eric LaRocca. This is his second full-length novel that I've read and really enjoyed. This was kindly sent over to me by Blackstone Publishing, and it's really rare that I ever accept gifts from publishers. I'm not a fan of like unsolicited book mail or anything like that, but when the publisher got in touch with me, I was like, yes, absolutely, send that book my way because I cannot wait to get my hands on it. So the story follows Ashley, who is a bereaved father who has lost his son and his wife, and he's living this really strange sort of lifestyle. Like by day, you know, he's keeping up appearances, everything seems normal with him, he seems to be coping, but by night he's leading a completely different life. He started this Craigslist business where he advertises himself for people who are looking to end their own lives. And when they get in contact with him and arrange to meet up with him, I don't think they really understand what's ahead of them. What he does is that he takes these really damaged, troubled individuals and he places them in a coffin and he buries them alive for half an hour to an hour. It's a really bizarre business model. But it's kind of working out for him, you know? He is making a bit of cash doing this. But it's not until he encounters someone from doing this who really changes his perspective, his ideology, and things just get much, much darker than they already are. Like, things are pretty bleak already. But I really, really enjoyed this. Eric LaRocca is known for his short story collections, and I've never read a story from him that I've never not enjoyed. I absolutely tore through this book. It was such a weird, engrossing read. I can't recommend it enough for people who are into these weird, unhinged horror stories. The next book that I picked up was Malice by John Gwynne. So this is the first book in a 4-part series. And I'm going to explain this really loosely because when it comes to fantasy, I am absolutely dreadful at trying to describe the plot, to describe the world building. I'm just going to really try to simplify it because I'm bad at trying to give a synopsis for these types of books. The story follows a number of different characters and each chapter is from a different character's perspective. It's not too overwhelming. There isn't like a whole heap of characters that we have to keep track of. And what I really enjoyed about this book is that all the characters' names are very pronounceable. I really did appreciate that because usually I will make up names for characters in fantasy books because I can't pronounce them. So I'm like, I'll just call you Frank. So while we get to know the characters, and there are a few younger characters in this who initially I was like, oh, I don't want to read from like a kid's perspective. And the kids ended up being probably the most interesting side of the story for this for me. The overarching storyline is that there are different provinces that are all ruled by kings, and a prophecy that was made a long time ago starts to become reality. And there's one leader who's trying to get all the different kings together in order to notify them that like things are about to kick off, like a war is coming and we need to be prepared. And everyone just dismisses him, being like, yeah, that's just an old prophecy. Like, nobody cares about that. But it's real and it's coming and it is fascinating. So I will say the one downside to reading this was that there's no family tree in this book. I believe in the rest of the installments in the series there is a family tree, but that is one thing that I was actively having to look up, and someone on Reddit made a family tree so that the people who start reading the series can go and click on and see the relation of characters between like the different houses, because that is something when it comes to reading a new to me fantasy series I really struggle with, and I need to constantly keep reminding like, who's this again? Like, who's he related to? Or like, what's he doing? What's his main objective? So I was really grateful to find that online. But yeah, that was the one downside, that I couldn't just like flip to the back of the book to be like, okay. So yeah, there's a lot of political intrigue to this. There are really fun, interesting characters. There are some really maniacal characters in this as well. And I am absolutely going to be continuing on with the series. And I was just really pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this. And then the 10th and final book that I read in March was Boulder by Eva Baltasar. This is a book that I picked up on a whim from a charity shop. So this follows a lesbian woman who enters a relationship where at first everything seems nice, but then it really becomes the story of two people who completely drift apart and who completely want different things. And it ends up being a story of resentment and depression and cheating and scandal. It's a very short novella and it is full of fairly unlikable characters, which I'm not complaining about. I really like reading unlikable characters. I like characters that have a bit of grit to them. And while I did enjoy the novella for what it was, I did kind of struggle to understand what was generally likable about the main character, what the draw was to her. She was very standoffish. She was very in it for herself. Her and her partner ended up having a baby, and then she's resentful of the baby because she feels the baby has ruined the dynamic of their relationship, and that, you know, they're not the same people that they were before this baby entered their life. It was definitely a weird, interesting little novella, but it's one of those books that I would regard as like a one and done, which is why I ended up unhauling my copy of it, because I was like, yeah, it was an interesting read for sure, but I have no interest in ever reading it again. Then getting into the books that I read in April, we're starting out with Pine by Francine Toon. This was a folk horror book that I had my eye on for quite some time, and I ended up borrowing it from the Dublin Horror Club. And I'm really glad that I did, because not only am I just knocking another folk horror tale that I wanted to get off my list, but I ended up really enjoying it. Even though we're reading from the perspective of a young girl, it feels like she has a good head on her shoulders, that she's wise beyond her years. And I didn't find it all that jarring, because typically, like I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of reading from the perspective of children. So the book being set in the Scottish Highlands, it has this beautiful atmospheric rural vibe to it that again is absolutely necessary in a folk horror story. This book is about a young girl called Lauren, and she is living with her troubled father, and we're starting out the story with Lauren and her father driving home when a woman who's really disheveled wanders out into the middle of the road and collapses, and they decide that together they'll take her home and kind of nurse her back to health and try to figure out everything to do with her the next day. And when they wake up in the morning, she has completely disappeared. This disappearance leans into the disappearance of Lauren's mother and trying to come to terms and understand what actually happened there. So there is a good element of mystery to the story, but I do feel that while I did enjoy it for what it was, the ending was a bit of a letdown. It was kind of like an open ending, and I feel like it would have been a bit stronger if the plotline had been kind of wrapped up in a more succinct manner. But I also feel like this is a great place to start if you're someone who's interested in getting into folk horror. Then the next book that I picked up was Cycle of the Werewolf by Stephen King. This is a short novella. It also is illustrated, and I really didn't know what to expect from it. I haven't really read much horror about werewolves. That's kind of one of my blind spots. I've watched a lot of horror about werewolves, but not really read that much. And so I knew this was a great place to really start, and that this story went on to inspire the film adaptation Silver Bullet. The story is told over the span of a year, and it starts out on the night of a full moon, where a poor person ends up being attacked in a really brutal, graphic way and ends up losing their life. So it's really mysterious how this person died. They're suspecting that it was some sort of animal attack, but then the same thing happens on the next full moon, and then the next full moon, and they realize that there is a pattern. But it's not until a young boy in the town ends up almost being a victim, and he gets away and he tells the authorities that it was a werewolf that attacked me. And initially it's kind of like laughed off, but sooner or later people start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. They realize that maybe the story that this kid is telling actually has some truth to it. So it's a book that you can read really in less than an hour, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think the illustrations really made it for me. And it's been quite some time since I've read something that had a similar sort of vibe to this, but yeah, it's definitely a new favourite Stephen King story for me for sure. Then the next two books that I picked up were both by Becky Chambers, and they were the Monk and Robot series. So I read the Psalm for the Wild Built and A Prayer for the Crown Shy, and I really didn't know if this was going to be my cup of tea at all. I had seen like really positive reviews about them, but I just didn't know if they would be for me. And let me tell you, they absolutely were. When I finished the second book, I immediately had to Google whether there was going to be another one in the series. And though the authoress claims that there may be something in the future, she feels that the characters are exactly where they need to be right now. And I was just kind of like, oh. So the story follows a non-binary character called Sibling Dex, who works as a travelling tea monk, and they travel from town to town in their wagon, and they have a timetable that they're meant to stick to, but suddenly they decide to go off the beaten track and go into the woods and just kind of explore the area that they've been told all their life that they really shouldn't go into, just because when people wander off the roads into the wilderness, these people usually never come back. But this ends up working out for Sibling Dex, as they end up encountering a robot who ends up becoming their best friend. And this robot has been abandoned. It's still working and it's still collecting data, as its main mission that was programmed into it was to discover what makes humans happy. So the two end up starting a really beautiful, charming little friendship, and they become travel partners, and they continue to travel around. Moscap, the robot, is really obviously into helping people, so everywhere they go there's a nice little side quest where he's helping the local people, and it's just such a charming, light-hearted read, and it's definitely something that I wouldn't necessarily gravitate towards had I known the ins and outs of it, but I'm glad that I picked these up from the library when I did. And then the last book that I picked up in April was Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung. So this is a short story collection that I started last year, and I read the first story in it and it blew me away to such an extent that I was like, there's no other story in this that's going to beat that, that's going to be better than that, that's going to be more entertaining than that. So I just kind of put it down and forgot about it. So going through the books that I have paused on my story graph, which is a great thing if you're into your reading stats and you take your reading stats really seriously, especially when it comes to how many days it takes you to finish a book. It's great that you can just pause something that you're not really into at the moment and then get back to it later, and it doesn't mess up with your stats at all. Anyway, going through those, I decided that this was going to be the next book of my paused books to read and to finish. And it was a fantastic, eclectic mix of short stories, incredibly weird, bizarre, over the top. I will not spoil the first story in it because I still do think that that is the best one. The second story in it is also incredibly strong. It's about a woman who takes birth control, but it ends up working out for her in a negative where she continues to take her birth control and it ends up getting her pregnant. As the author is Korean, she is using humor and horror and sci-fi to explore real themes such as the negative effects of capitalism on society and the negative effects of the patriarchy. So I absolutely adored this, but be sure if you're going to pick it up to know that you should go into it with a good sense of humour about it. Then getting into the books that I read in May, I started it off really strong by reading Lost in the Garden by Adam S. Leslie. Because it was coming into summer, I felt like this was going to be a great summer read, which it absolutely was. So this follows a couple of girls as they are living in a small rural town in England. And all their lives they've been told that they need to stay where they are and that they can't go into another town, which is a couple of hours away, called Albany, because the people who go there never come back. But one of the girls' boyfriends ends up going, and then she loses contact with him once he gets there. She decides to take two of her friends on a road trip to Albany to find out what happened with them. And this is not a typical story. The other aspect to the plot line is that they're ghosts roaming the land, but they have a tendency to attack the living. So if you're caught in a field or caught in a dead end, you can be assured that you will be followed by these slow, shuffling ghosts and be bludgeoned to death. Now, the writing style was initially described to me as a fever dream, and I get really nervous when books are described like that because it just makes me think of like Bunny by Mona Awad and like that style of writing where I would have to reread a paragraph over and over again and then I still wouldn't be able to make sense of it. I still wouldn't be able to picture what is happening in my mind. So anytime someone uses that term to describe someone's writing style, I'm like, oh no, I'm probably not going to enjoy it because I'm not going to be able to visualize what's happening in it. I would say this is very much on the lighter end of the fever dream writing style. It is very readable. I flew through it in quite a short amount of time, which is surprising because I had been putting it off because of the length, because I was like, oh, it's a bit chunky. I loved the dynamic of the girls' friendships and the inner struggles that the girls have with each other. The characters felt really fleshed out and real, and they really reminded me of watching Skins back in the day. That was just the kind of vibe that I was getting from them. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I recommend it to anyone who's into kind of weird folk horror, fever dream-esque stories. Then the next book that I picked up was Weird Fiction, an anthology. This has been put out by Penguin. They put out 4 or 5 stories under their Weird Fiction series, and so far I've read 2 of them, but this is the first one that I decided to read. There were a couple of stories in this, such as the story by Edgar Allan Poe that I've already read in different collections, but for the most part, these were all new stories for me. I will say the downside to this was that I didn't find the stories weird enough. There were a few that dealt with cosmic horror, but they just felt that they were more kind of stereotypical horror tales and ghost stories rather than kind of weird cosmic horror, which it kind of promotes itself as. My favourite short story in this was The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs, because it's a story that I never read before and it has been so heavily referenced in pop culture over the years that even though I hadn't read it, I felt very familiar with it, but I was just delighted to finally actually get it read. Then I picked up House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. This had been on my TBR for quite some time, and I felt like I was kind of procrastinating on picking it up because I knew I was going to really enjoy it, but I was kind of saving it for when I was feeling more in a kind of reading slump mood so that I knew that I'd have something on the shelf that I know I would enjoy and that would be kind of easy for me to read. So the story follows Miriam Shaw, who's a young woman, as she's living in the slums with her brother. They're living in immense poverty, and Miriam is really the one who's the breadwinner of the family. When she goes out, she tries to work, she pickpockets, she does whatever she can in order to take money home, and unfortunately her only family is her brother, who has a really bad gambling addiction, and he usually will just take whatever money that she has and just waste it. And he's also a drunk. She just feels she's absolutely trapped in this lifestyle, and she sees that there's an ad for a new blood maiden in this mysterious house, and she decides to take them up on the offer to see if she would be able to earn a decent living doing this. And being a blood maiden is really kind of like looked down upon in their society. It's viewed as dirty, it's viewed as like beneath people. She will be taken care of, she will be taken in. She doesn't have to worry about putting food on the table. She doesn't have to worry about where the next meal is coming from or anything like that. So in her mind, it is a super positive thing for her. So she ends up working as a blood maiden for the House of Hunger, and she's living under the rule of a cruel countess who is incredibly sickly and just uses these young girls for their blood. So with this story, you can really see the influence of kind of vampires and the influence of Countess Bathory, who used to bathe in the blood of virgins, believing that it would make her immortal and all that sort of thing. While I did really enjoy the story, and I always enjoy Alexis Henderson's writing style, I think her prose is excellent. A lot of the times I feel like I have to have a dictionary out because I come across words that I've just never seen before. So I do really enjoy that aspect to her writing, but unfortunately I didn't feel that this was a better story than The Year of the Witching, which has been my favourite book from her so far. And then the last book that I read in May was Victorian Psycho by Virginia Fito. So this was a book that I was seeing, you know, on BookTube, on social media and all that sort of thing, seeing that it was being very much hyped up. And while I'm quite reluctant to read books that are on the current hype train at the moment on social media, I saw this at the library and I decided I'd just give it a go, and I'm really glad that I did. This is probably the most entertaining book that I've read so far of the year, and absolutely one of the best books that I've read so far this year. This follows the story of Winifred Naughty, who is a governess trying to work for the Pound family, and she's probably one of the most despicable, wretched characters that I've come across in a book in quite some time, which made the reading experience fantastic. It was so entertaining. It was so funny. She's put in charge of two young children, Drusilla and Andrew, and let me tell you, this is the type of woman that you do not want anywhere near your children. She actively tells them lies. She actively tells them things that they are not of age to know about, and all the while just trying to really break down the family dynamic. She also loves to torture the house staff, and she is just a real piece of shit. I thought that there was a really good mix between the dark, disturbing stuff happening in the story and then Winifred's own ability to be the comedic relief of the story. It just made everything feel much more balanced. And if you're someone who's really into reading classics, but you want to read more contemporary stuff and you want to read more kind of like unhinged female characters, you should check this book out. Finally, getting into the last month, which is June, the first book that I picked up for this month was Stay in the Light by A.M. Shine. This is the sequel to his first book, The Watchers. And I was really interested to see where this would go or how a sequel to The Watchers would play out, because when I read The Watchers, I really enjoyed it, and it definitely can be read as a standalone. Even though I felt that the story had been wrapped up pretty well, I was interested to see what the follow-up was going to be. And I can say that in this story, we are still with our main character, Mina, and her very cute, lovable bird. So like the first book, this story is another folk horror tale, and it centres around the Fae, it centres around Irish folk tales, and if you know anything about Irish fairies, they're not the cute, whimsical little mischief makers that you may be familiar with. They are something much darker. They are usually referred to as changelings. They have the ability to shapeshift. They are just really disturbing things, and it's why you'll hear in rural Ireland from a lot of people who are into that sort of thing that you never mess with the fairies, like you never destroy a fairy ring or anything like that. So this book introduced a few new characters into the storyline, and each chapter is from a different character's perspective. And I wasn't really a huge fan of that, but I liked where the story was going, and it felt like a decent follow-up to The Watchers. So if you're someone who read The Watchers and you might be a little bit iffy about whether you should read Stay in the Light or whether it's worthwhile, I absolutely think that it is a really decent follow-up. It definitely explores more about the lore and the history, and that's something that I really enjoyed reading this time around. Now we're getting on to the most ambitious book that I've picked up so far this year, and it luckily turned out to be my favourite book of the year so far. It's been my first 5-star read of the year, and that book is Ulysses by James Joyce. Yes, I finally read and finished Ulysses. So every year I have been trying to motivate myself to read this in the run-up to Bloomsday, which takes place on the 16th of June, which is the same day that the story takes place on. It is a very lofty novel. It is notoriously difficult to read. It was written over the span of like 10 or 12 years, so Joyce's writing style changes within that time. So while when I initially started reading it, I found it to be easy enough for me, it did progressively get more and more difficult. It's written in a stream of consciousness style, which I also didn't really struggle with, but that is something that I found very daunting going into it. So there was a lot of reasons why I was always really intimidated by this book. I'd say the main outcome for this was that there was no reason for me to feel intimidated by this book for all those many years. There was no reason for me to believe that I wasn't going to be up to the standard of reading to be able to enjoy this or to be able to even just comprehend it. There was no reason for me to feel insecure about this book, you know? And that was really a nice feeling to have once I finally finished it, was that like, wow, my perspective of not only this book, but myself was completely wrong. And that realization just made me feel so much more confident in myself and my reading skills, because like that's something that I've always been anxious about since I've been younger. I was moved around a lot as a child, so my reading ability was very delayed, so I always have felt like I'm behind, and that is a feeling that I've carried unfortunately with me into adulthood. So when it comes to books like this or, you know, any other sort of great literary works, I always feel that I'm like too dumb, too stupid, too slow to be able to comprehend these books, and that it's not even going to be worth my while trying to sit down because I'm just not going to get it, and that just isn't the case. So reading this was definitely more of a personal growth experience for me than it was about just reading the book in the first place. Like the book itself is funny, it's witty, it threw things at me that I just was not expecting. I will say that this edition isn't great because there are moments where other languages are used and then there's no translations for those languages, such as French, Latin, and German. So there were times where I was like, I have no idea what they're saying to each other, but I'm just going to keep on reading. But aside from that, I think I did very well with this book. And in such a short time frame too. I read this in 8 days. Like I get notions about reading bigger books, and I always feel that I have to try to binge read through them in a short amount of time to be able to get the most out of it. So I really can't say anything that will fault this book. It is absolutely what everyone says about it. It is something that is a great work of literature. It is an absolute masterpiece when you think about the time frame that this was written in, when you think about the experimental writing style, and you think about how Joyce went about writing it in the first place. And I think some of the elements of the storyline are very relevant to today's society. I know this book is not for everyone. It's especially not for a lot of people who enjoy me just reading horror stuff. From time to time, I do like to dip into classics, and I do enjoy a challenging literary experience, and this was definitely one of them. The next book that I picked up was Severance by Ling Ma. So this is a book that I had on my radar for quite some time. I love books about apocalypses. I love books about like the end of the world, about viruses and all that sort of thing. And this had all of that in it. And it also had a millennial main character called Candace who works as an office worker, and her life is so dreary and she's just doing the same thing day after day that she barely even notices when the Shen virus takes hold and wipes out the majority of the population. So the story jumps back and forth in its timeline a little bit. So we have her with a group of survivors as she's trying to figure out whether this is something that she should be doing, or would she be better off branching off by herself, because she's already starting to notice a hierarchy with this group. And then it jumps back to her life before as an office worker. I didn't find this book all that engaging. I didn't feel all that invested in Candace's story. I was expecting that the story would take more of a positive turn, in the sense of like she realizes how she wasn't appreciating her life before the virus, and now it's her chance to kind of make up for that. And it wasn't really that sort of story. It was just a very kind of like down in the doldrums sort of tale, and it just didn't really inspire me. It didn't really move my needle all that much, and I ended up giving it 2 stars. So June was a very wishy-washy month where I'd read something that I don't really gel well with, and then I'd pick something up that would absolutely blow me away. And the next one is one of those books, and it was The Elementals by Michael McDowell. So this is a book that I had been meaning to read for years, and I finally got it out of the library and I finally read it, and I'm so happy to, because I know this is a favourite for many people who are into the haunted house trope in the horror community. This is a book that has always been hyped up to me, and I got a little bit burnt out on reading stories about haunted houses and, you know, sentient houses and all that sort of thing a while ago. But I finally decided that since this is a tale that takes place over the summertime, that this would be the perfect time to read it, and it absolutely was. So the story follows 2 families, the McCraes and the Savages, and they have been brought together through various family members marrying and all that sort of thing. And the story is really about the 3 houses that they own, which are vacation homes. These are old Victorian houses on the beach on the Alabama coast, and they go there every year for their holiday. But 2 of the houses are hospitable and 1 is not. 1 is slowly but surely being consumed by a whole heap of sand, and no one ever goes in there. And from a very early age, the children of the family are told not to play in that house, to stay away from it, to never go in it. And we're reading from the perspective of some of these children who are now grown up, who have children themselves, who are thinking back to their childhood and how much that house actually scared them, and how they're trying to put that fear into their own children just to keep them safe. There definitely feels like there's something living in that 3rd house. There's something waiting for them. There's something specifically calling to them. I completely understand the hype and why so many people have told me over the years that I need to read this story. It was absolutely incredible. It had such a great atmosphere. I really got invested in the characters, and anytime something bad happened, it would really get my heart racing. And I wasn't expecting to have like such a visceral reaction to this book, because I rarely have reactions like that, because I've read so much horror over the years. I'm a little bit desensitized. This book is everything that I hoped it would be. It was just so great to read something that I'm like, I can understand the hype. I can see why so many people love it. And now I'm one of those people. And then finally, the last book that I read at the very, very end of June was The Unworthy by Augustina Bastarrica. So this was the book that I picked out to read for my first month of properly restarting my book club. And if you want to get into that, the Discord for it is down below. It's completely free. It's for anyone who just wants to pop in. It's very casual. If you're someone who just wants to read some hidden gems, some horror, some cult fiction, you should absolutely check it out because it's good fun. This was a book that I was really looking forward to. I have read all of Augustina Bastarrica's work previously. I obviously really loved Tender is the Flesh, and I feel like this is more kind of in line with that sort of writing style. So we're following an unreliable, unnamed narrator who is living in a convent, and she's writing the story of her life and like the daily things that she experiences in this convent in private, secretly. There is a real fear of her being found out because you're not allowed to be doing any of this. She's very much breaking protocol. So she is a member of the House of Sacred Sisterhood, but she is at the lowest tier, which are referred to as the Unworthy. And she and the other women at this tier do whatever they can in order to one-up themselves, in order to put themselves in a higher position so that they may ascend to a higher tier. And some of the things that they get up to backstab each other is just so disturbing. These women aren't here because they want to be here, because they want to be close to God or anything like that. They're here out of fear because in the outside world, things have gone to shit. There has been an apocalypse and they think that they're in a much better position because at least they've got, you know, a roof over their head and they get fed kind of, sort of. So it's easier for them to live in here than it is to try and survive out there. So while I really enjoyed the world building and the goings on in this convent and how awful so many of the characters were, and the weird kind of character development that ended up happening, I did want a little bit more of what was happening in the outside world, or maybe more sort of flashbacks to the before times to round out my feelings around the main character, because we really don't know all that much about her. and she ends up starting to make choices that just feel very unpredictable for what we've learned of her so far. So I felt like this was a solid 3.5 read. While I can definitely identify with areas that could have been improved upon, like I even feel like if this book had been a little bit longer, that probably would have been more beneficial and it would have been more of a satisfying read for me personally. I still really enjoyed it for what it was, and I'm still thinking about the book even weeks after finishing it now. And I'm glad that this was my first pick for my book club because it seemed that a lot of other people enjoyed it for what it was as well. Oh my god, we're finally done. I'm so relieved. I've had to film this over 2 days because it got so hot in my room I just started melting. I promise to never let a reading wrap up accumulate to this severity ever again because that was rough. So I really hope you enjoyed my suffering with trying to remember and regurgitate everything that I've read so far this year. If you've read any of these books, let me know. If you agree or disagree with any of my opinions, comment below. And if you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my Instagram and TikTok where I make short form bookish content that I don't really share over here. And if you haven't done so already, feel free to like and subscribe. It gives me a good indication of the videos that you want to see in the future, and it really helps the channel out and I greatly appreciate it. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this long video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.